Hi, this is Dr. Branham. Today I'll be doing a video on the Texas Constitution. Share my screen here. This video on the Texas Constitution is a supplement to your assigned chapter on the Texas Constitution. It's designed to do a couple of things. One, I'm hopeful that it'll give you a better understanding of what went on with the Texas Constitution, how it developed, and how it works in today's government. And two, I hope it helps you do better on the test, because a whole lot of these things that we're going to cover here on this video are on the test. So let's get started. First, what is the Constitution? The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In a democracy, the Constitution supersedes any legislation passed by elected officials. It's a contract with the people. So we've heard a lot of times where a legislature will pass a bill and they'll say that that is unconstitutional. They'll actually take it to the courts and have the courts rule on the constitutionality of legislation that's been passed. The Constitution, if the Constitution has provisions where that legislation cannot be passed, then it will be thrown out. The Constitution is superior to any legislation passed by elected officials. It's part of that contract. For instance, if you have a right to free speech, any legislation that limits your ability to have free speech can be taken to the court for review of its constitutionality. It's also a charter or a plan of government. The Constitution just tells you what your government's going to be. It outlines the institutions, what the executive, legislative, and judicial, and then it describes what and how much power the government will have, how these powers are limited, who will act on those powers, and so forth. This is a very difficult thing. Building a proper constitution is very difficult, and it's almost impossible. You can't have a perfect constitution. That's the reason why constitutions tend to be amended a lot. You just can't cover everything that you need to know. The federal Constitution, even with the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments, those were added on basically to get support for the Constitution. But soon afterwards, by the election of 1800, we knew we need to amend our Constitution because there were provisions in it in presidential elections that just had to be adjusted. So building a Constitution is difficult. Planning out what the government should look like, what powers each should have, how are you going to check those powers? It's very difficult. Providing the fundamental law in which legal systems are established is also part of the Constitution. Constitutions are designed to protect they're designed to protect the minority. In American history, the minority is with the most constitutional protection has been rich people. If you look at the original Constitution, you can see that the framers of that Constitution were worried about having a democracy where the voters can come in and vote to take away their property, to take away what they have. They wanted the protection from that because as large landowners, they were in the minority. They wanted that protection. Now, other minorities, obviously, they didn't get those same protections to. Slavery is obviously the prime example, where we had a constitution that allowed slavery. So there are times when constitutions don't protect minorities. Good constitutions do, though. And we've amended our Constitution since that time to protect all of these people. But it wasn't there in our initial process. And the fact that it wasn't there allowed the people to oppress minority groups in society. So constitutions are very important, and they're very difficult to create. So the Texas Constitution of 1876, which is the Constitution that we now have in the state of Texas, it was created largely influenced by Democrats in post-Reconstruction period. After the South lost the Civil War, the Republican Party came in. And remember that Lincoln was the president of the Republican Party. In the 1860 election, where Lincoln first won, Lincoln lost 998 of 1,000 southern counties. Lincoln was not a popular president because he was going to get rid of slavery. And in the process of getting rid of slavery, we had a war. There's a big economic turnover. The state of Mississippi, when the war started, was the richest state in the nation. Ever since the war is over, Mississippi has been the poorest state in the nation. It's had high consequences. So when the Republicans came in after the war, they implemented a lot of Republican rule. We had a lot of Republicans in legislative seats, a lot of African Americans in legislative seats. And then after the 1870s, after the Hayes-Tilden election, which was, let's see, 1876, that Hayes-Tilden election, there was a deal made where basically the southern states would be left alone. Republicans would go out of the southern states, allow the people who lived in those states to reestablish their governments, and as long as they had certain guidelines, like they couldn't reestablish slavery, but they certainly reestablished a segregated society. They reestablished a society where it was very difficult if you're an African American to live in that society. They established that, but they did it in a trade-off. There was a Hayes-Tilden election. Tilden had won that election pretty handily, but there was some controversy on certain states. In the end, there was an agreement. Let Hayes win the election. The South will have their states back. So the Democrats in the South came in during the Reconstruction period, or the post-Reconstruction period, and in response to these radical Republican rule that they had been in after the Civil War, they decided to create a government where the institutions in particular were very weak. They did not want a strong government. They wanted a weakened government where a lot of people would run the government and a lot of people would have very limited power in doing so. So it's weakened government institutions by severely limiting their power. The governor in particular was a very diluted position in government. We often associate governors with the president of the United States as if they're the president of their state. If you compare the governor of Texas to the president of the United States, the governor of Texas has far, far less power in the state of Texas than the president has in the United States. Now, as time has went by, governors have figured out ways to increase that power. Governor Abbott, in particular, has been able to, during his time as governor, to do that. So the adjustments have been made, but the governor himself or herself is still a very weak position. The Constitution was also designed to protect the agriculture economy, which suffered incredibly after the Civil War. I mean, it was thriving before the Civil War, obviously, with slavery intact, with slavery gone, trying to protect agriculture in Texas, which was the central part of their economy, was a top priority of the new Constitution. Now, the structure of the Constitution of Texas shows that Article 1 has the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights in some ways looks like the same Bill of Rights at the federal level. But if you look at it, there's heavy overlap, but the Bill of Rights in the Texas Constitution is much more extensive and much more details. They actually define a lot of words and a lot of things going on in the Bill of Rights. So if you read it, you'll think, okay, this is much, much longer than the first 10 amendments of the federal Constitution. And you're right, even though it says a lot of the same things. Then Article 2, almost strangely, is an article dedicated to separation of powers. And they go into high detail about the separation of powers that, where you can't overlap, where the executive branch will not overtake the legislative branch and so forth. And they did all this before they actually established the structure of these institutions, which they started in Article 3 with the structure of the legislative branch. And they go into extensive detail on its organization, the proceedings that they can go by, all the rules and the proceedings and so forth, the powers that the legislators have and the legislature has, and the restrictions on them. And if you're a legislator in Texas, you've figured out a way to gain a lot of power doing things that were not covered. But the coverage of the Texas Constitution has basically created a legislature that isn't paid. I mean, their pay is so minuscule, it's hard to actually say that it's actually a compensation for their time. And when you start thinking about how much time that they spend legislating and thinking that I think on the average they make about $17,000 a year as a legislator, that's very low pay. But at the same time, they figured out a way, because They have abilities to have what I call conflicts of interest. They have the ability to go out and get jobs and then be on legislative committees that helps their corporations and so forth. On the side, legislators do quite well for themselves. There are very few poor legislators, but they've done this by looking into the system and finding ways to take advantage of the system. And so that's what's happened with our legislature. And you see it pretty much across the board. The executive branch is covered in Article 4, talks about the governor, the cabinet office powers, because there's a lot of cabinet offices. And we know that the governor doesn't have a lot of power. For instance, the governor doesn't appoint any cabinet members. They're all elected at large statewide, which means getting any kind of gel and teamwork in government is almost impossible. If you're in the federal government and you're the president of the United States, those cabinet secretaries report directly to you, and the president can always ask for the resignation of those cabinet secretaries if he or she sees fit. So it's a lot different as the Texas executive branch, the controller of public accounts, the attorney general, even the lieutenant governor. They're all elected. So the governor has no power in what they do. The governor can only have power in the office itself. The judiciary is covered on Article 5. There's 6 levels of the state judiciary that are covered. When you go to Texas Politics, the judicial or the justice system, and you read that chapter, you'll see a lot of that. Article 7 and 8 deal with education and finances, a lot of taxation restrictions there. The property assessment and collection at the county level is also covered in Article 8. So it's important to understand the structure of government when you start talking about Texas. Counties are subservient to the state. Now, the state of Texas, for instance, cannot have a property tax at the state level, but counties obviously can. Counties assess property taxes and they collect, and they make those assessments. If you own a piece of property, the county has assessed the value of that, and they tax you based on that assessment. So that's what Article 8 does in the Constitution. The Texas Constitution is similarity to the federal Constitution. There's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences also. And I think it's important to see so that you can have an understanding of the Texas Constitution. Separation of powers. Each branch of government works independently, so it's the same there with its own set of government powers. The federal government has a set of powers for the executive, legislative, and judicial, although the judicial is very minimal in what it actually says. And so they had to go into interpretation later. The Texas government does the same thing. Democratic governance, the government of the people, mainly preserved by the election of government officials to represent people. In other words, it has a Republican government. There's not a lot of direct democracy in Texas politics. There is some, more than at the federal level, but by and large, we are a republic. We elect people to represent us. And as a republic, we'll elect a state representative, a state senator, a governor, a lieutenant governor. Those people do the job of legislating and running the government for us. We don't do that directly ourselves. A direct democracy would actually involve a vote of every single piece of legislation, and we don't do that. Thank goodness, because that wouldn't be a very efficient system. But the states do have more direct democracy than the federal government. And the Bill of Rights were similar. The Texas Constitution and the federal Constitution have a Bill of Rights. Much of them are the same rights. So that is there. And people think, well, if the federal Constitution has it, the states have to have it. Actually, that wasn't the case until we started incorporating the federal Constitution onto the states in the 1960s. We did not, just because the federal government had a constitution, for instance, that said you can't commit illegal search and seizures and use that evidence against somebody, states could do it a lot. I mean, if you didn't have it in your state constitution, states could go in and illegally obtain evidence and use it against you in court until that was incorporated onto the states in the 1960s. So there's a lot of similarities with the Texas and federal Constitution. but there's a lot of ways that they're not alike, like direct democracy. I was talking about that. The Texas Constitution provides for more direct election of public officials, including direct election of even cabinet members, judges, the chief executive, the lieutenant governor, while the president of the United States selects all the cabinet secretaries. Only the executive branch, the only executive branch appointment made by the governor of Texas is the Texas Secretary of State. And the main function of the Secretary of State isn't to go negotiate with other states and have policy meetings and create a relationship. No, the Secretary of State administers elections. That's what the Secretary of State does in Texas. So it's a lot different, and the power of the governor is much smaller. And this is also true in other states. Direct democracy is highly valued in state constitutions, more than in the federal constitution. We don't have direct democracy in the federal constitution. We elect people to make our laws for us. For instance, 27 states currently have initiatives, like legislation enacted by the vote of the people, where you put it up there and you have an initiative. Constitutional amendments in Texas are created by the vote of the people. The people vote yay or nay, and actually they are the last step in having a constitutional amendment. 18 states also have recall provisions. The most popular one is California. They've had a couple of governor recalls in recent history, where that's just an election to remove an elected official from office before their term is completed. Most of the time, it doesn't work. Most of the time, the voters are going there and saying, no, we're keeping the person we have. But when you have these provisions, people work very hard to get rid of the elected officials that they don't want. Finances. The Texas Constitution is unlike the federal Constitution in that the Texas Constitution requires that the state remain free of debt. That's a lot different than the federal government. The federal government is well over $30 trillion in debt. You start thinking about how much $30 trillion is. That's a lot of money per person. I mean, we're over $100,000 per person now that we owe in government to the federal government, that the federal government is in debt for. So the federal government runs debts constantly. They constantly have budgets that overspend. They don't even try to balance their budget. The state is required to balance their budget. So are the 90,000 other governments in the United States. Every government has to balance its budget, with the exception of the federal government. The Texas Constitution has more restrictions on legislative taxation ability. For instance, it's unconstitutional to have a state property tax. We talked about that. Federal government doesn't have these restrictions. They can have, they are, if you read the Texas Constitution, it basically says they're free to tax the people. And so those restrictions are not there. And while legislators have the power to pass a state income tax in Texas, it's pretty much considered political suicide for you to pass a state income tax in Texas. It's anybody who votes for it will have a very difficult time winning re-election. So we don't have a state income tax in Texas. Only 8 states don't have an income tax. We're blessed enough to be one of those. If we have people that we want to come in and do jobs, this is a carrot for them. People who move to Texas to have a job, them not having to pay a state income tax means it's more money in their pocket. Classic example is professional athletes. Professional athletes who come to Houston Rockets, the Houston Texans, the Houston Astros, they don't have to pay a state income tax off of their millions of dollars that they have in salary. They don't have to pay that. And that's a really good bonus. So Texas Constitution is unlike the federal Constitution mainly, and then it restricts the government more. There's not as much government freedom. Another thing that we're unlike is the document dynamics. The Texas Constitution is easily amended. None of the current Constitution and its amendment process is really kind of the same theme in the other states. Texas has about 10 times more words in its Constitution than the United States Constitution. You can read the United States Constitution. You can sit down during lunch and read it very easily. Texas Constitution is huge. And matter of fact, it's much longer than almost every state constitution. The one exception is Alabama. I think Alabama actually has their state constitutions about 4 times larger than Texas, and Texas is second largest at at over 90,000 words. So the Texas Constitution is huge. It's actually more than twice as long as the average state constitution. But state constitutions are much larger than the federal Constitution. Now, I had a friend who is a professor now at Houston Baptist. He was the provost at Houston Baptist, who specializes in this. And he says the reason why this occurs is because it's necessary, because state governments have so many more responsibilities than the federal government. You think about it, the federal government has restricted responsibilities in their constitution. Now, it seems like a lot because they seem like they're everywhere, defense, Social Security. I mean, there's a lot of money going on out there. But think about what the states actually run. States actually run all public education. They do all highways, hospitals, universities. Excuse me. They have a lot to do. And then you start going down and start thinking that county governments are actually extensions of state governments, and that state constitutions cover what counties do too, and the municipalities and so forth. There's a reason why state constitutions are long, because they need to be. So I don't think it's an accident, and I don't think it's because of poor administration. That's just the way state constitutions are. The Texas Constitution Amendment process. It's a much easier process than the federal Constitution, and it's next to impossible for a controversial amendment to go through the federal Constitution. But in the state of Texas, if you want to have an amendment, you have it introduced in the legislature, and 2/3 majority of the House, 2/3 majority of the Senate puts that constitutional amendment on the ballots. And then after that is placed on the ballot, the voters need to approve it. They can go up, thumbs up, or thumbs down. When these do not pass, it's usually because they're not well understood. They're not well worded. They have difficulty understanding. The voters have a difficulty understanding, because think about it. If 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate are passing a constitutional amendment, you got a lot of people from your party supporting that. 2/3 majority means you're going to have both Democrats and Republicans. You're not going to get it otherwise. So if you have 2/3 majority in the House with Republicans and Democrats, and in the Senate with Republicans and Democrats, chances are you're going to agree with the constitutional amendment. So by and large, they pass. Nearly all proposed amendments pass and are approved by the voters. And the ones that fail are usually because they're worded in such a way that they don't look like they should pass. So the trend is just to go ahead and say yes to all of them. And my advice is usually just go ahead and say yes to all of them, because the chances are that you will agree to it, and chances are it probably should be passed because a majority of the people want them. Between 1876 and 2007, there's lots of counting going on. The Constitution was amended 456 times. The Texas Constitution, 456 times. New sets of amendments are introduced to the voters after every legislative session. It's not unusual to have them. Don't be afraid to vote for them in most cases, because they have wide-ranging support by your elected officials. That's the end of this video. I hope it helps you with the state constitution. I appreciate your attention on this, and I hope that you're going to have a better understanding of the state constitution of Texas. You're going to do better on the test, and you'll be able to interact better with your peers when it comes to talking about the state constitution. Thank you for joining me. This is the end of the video. Look forward to seeing you in class. If you have any questions, send me an email. Happy to answer you. Happy to meet with you by Zoom if you like. Bye-bye.